Runaway bride starving in the desert. A Lakota chief found her and gave her the love she was denied. I found her by the smell of blood. Not a lot. Enough. The kind of smell the desert holds close to the ground at dusk, when the heat starts letting go and the air drops an inch and everything that was hidden underneath comes up. I was riding north along the dry fork of the Cheyenne, coming back from 3 days out checking the eastern boundary of our summer range, and my horse, a big gray gelding I called Crow, because he'd stolen a piece of dried meat from me the day I broke him and never apologized. Crow picked it up before I did. He slowed without me asking, turned his head maybe 10 degrees west. I trusted that animal the way I trust my own hands. I reined left and followed his nose. She was in the bottom of a dry wash, maybe 30 yards off the trail, sitting up, which surprised me. Her back against the cut bank, knees pulled in, her face turned away like she was watching something down the wash that only she could see. She'd been walking in that gown, white, or it had been white, probably that morning or the day before. Now it was the color of the canyon wall, caked to mid-thigh with red dust, the hem torn off clean in one long strip that she'd tied around her left foot. The foot was wrapped twice, loose, the knot already coming undone. Her hair was down, dark, thick, coming apart at whatever she'd put it up in. Some of it was stuck across her cheek with dried sweat. She didn't move when I rode up. She heard me. I know she heard me, her shoulders went tight. But she didn't move, and she didn't look. I got down, looped Crow's rein over a dead root sticking from the bank wall, took my canteen off the saddle and walked to within about 10 feet of her and stopped. She still hadn't looked at me. Her lips were cracked. The inside of her lower lip, where it had split, was the bright red of something only very recently stopped bleeding. I said in English, "Can you stand?" Not a question, really, more like I was asking the situation. She turned her head, looked at me. Her eyes were gray, the kind of gray that in better light might have been blue, I didn't know yet, and they were clear. That surprised me more than the sitting up. People bad enough off to be at the bottom of a wash in a wedding gown at dusk, alone in the Badlands, usually have something gone from the eyes. She didn't. She looked at me the way you look at a card someone just laid on the table, assessing. She said, "Are you going to hurt me?" Also not a question, she was measuring too. I said no. I held out the canteen. She looked at it, looked at me again. Then she reached out and took it and drank in the careful way of someone who's been dry long enough to know better than to rush. 3 swallows, a pause, 3 more. She held it out to give it back. I said, "Finish it." She drank the rest, wiped her mouth with the back of her hand, wedding gown, dust, the automatic dignity of a woman doing a plain thing. She said, "I don't have anything to give you." I said, "I know." That was the first conversation I ever had with Clara Prentice. My name is Standing Elk. I am the head man of a band of Oglala Lakota that has been camped for 14 summers in the Cheyenne River country, in the territory the government calls Dakota. I was 51 years old the summer I found her. I had been a widower for 7 years. I had 3 grown children, 2 sons living, 1 daughter gone to fever at age 6 whose face I still sometimes see in the fire at night. I had fought 4 separate engagements against the United States Cavalry, been shot twice, lost 12 men I had led poorly, and 1 I had led well but whose time came anyway. I had signed 2 pieces of paper I did not fully trust and kept every term of both of them. I had horses, cattle, a house I built myself from cottonwood and river stone, 400 acres of grazing range the federal agent acknowledged belonged to me personally, and enough reputation in the valley that white ranchers who didn't like Indians would still send a man to me when their cattle strayed into my range, because they knew I'd return them uncounted. I say all this not to make myself out to be something. I say it because you need to understand what was standing in that wash at dusk looking at a woman who had nothing. Not because it made me superior to her situation, because it made me capable of doing something about it. I picked her up, she let me. Didn't protest, didn't flinch, which told me how far gone she was in the legs. I set her on Crow and walked him out of the wash and north along the trail, and then another 2 miles to the river crossing that put us on my land. She held the saddle horn with both hands and didn't say a word the whole way. Once she swayed, and I put my hand on her knee to steady her without breaking stride, and she steadied without comment. It was full dark by the time we reached the house. My older son, Thomas, we call him by his Lakota name among ourselves. Tasunk Whitco's name was taken and we didn't use it, so we called him Hoxie, which means simply boy even though he was 32 years old. Hoxie was sitting on the porch. He saw me come in with a white woman on my horse, and he stood up slowly and looked at me the way my sons have looked at me since they were small, which is with that particular combination of respect and deep suspicion of what I've done now. I said to him in Lakota, "Heat some water, find something for her feet." He went inside. No questions. That is the one thing I taught my children absolutely. You take care of what arrives first, you talk about it after. I got her down and walked her inside. She sat in the chair by the fire and I knelt down and unwrapped the strip of gown from her foot. Her right foot was fine, just blistered some along the heel. The left, the one she'd wrapped, had a gash across the arch, not deep, but full of grit and a day old at least. I could smell it. I cleaned it with hot water and the carbolic that I kept in the box on the second shelf for exactly this kind of occasion, because this is the frontier and things happen. She hissed once through her teeth when the carbolic went in. Once. Then she held still. Hoxie brought bread and the remainder of a pot of beans that had been sitting warm on the back of the stove since supper. He set it in front of her and glanced at me and went back to the porch. She ate slowly. Not because she wasn't hungry, she was past hungry, into the hollow place after it, but because she was watching everything in the room while she ate and didn't want to appear to be watching. I recognized that. I'd done it myself in rooms where I wasn't sure of the ground. When she'd eaten most of it, she put the spoon down and said, "My name is Clara, Clara Prentice. As of about 2 days ago, it was supposed to be Clara Aldridge." I said, "Supposed to be." She said, "I walked out the morning of the wedding. I didn't plan well." A pause, obviously. I said, "Why?" She looked at me. I could see she was deciding whether I'd earned that yet. I didn't push. She said, "He was a man who hit things." I said, "I see." She said, "I found that out 3 days before the wedding. I walked out 2 days before I found you." I let that sit a moment. Then I said, "You sleep. We talk in the morning." She said, "I don't want to be trouble." I said, "You're not trouble. You're a person who needs a bed." Hoxie showed her the back room, which had been my daughter's room and was kept clean. I heard her lie down. I sat by the fire a while, not thinking anything in particular, just listening to the house settle the way it does at night when the temperature drops and the wood contracts, those quiet ticks that run from the roof down through the walls. She'd walked 2 days in a wedding gown through the Badlands, because the man she was supposed to marry hit things. I thought about that, what it took to make that choice, to leave the dress on, not because she wanted to, but probably because she had nothing else, and walk. Hoxie came in from the porch and sat across from me. He said in Lakota, "What are you going to do with her?" I said what I just did. "Feed her and let her sleep." He said, "And then?" I said, "Then she decides." He looked at the fire. He said, "Father," a warning in it. I said, "I know." He said, "There will be talk." I said, "There is always talk." He said, "From her people." I said, "Then her people will have to come and say it to my face." He was quiet. Then he got up and went to his room. He wasn't angry. He was my son and he knew me and he knew this was already decided, not by sentiment but by something simpler. I had found a person in the desert and brought her home. That's not complicated. That's just the thing you do. In the morning she was up before me. I came out to find her at the stove with a piece of cloth tied around her foot. She'd found the cotton strips in the second shelf box. Same one I'd used the night before, and rewrapped it properly. Not the way I'd left it, but better, tighter, with the knot on the outside of the arch where it wouldn't press on the gash. She'd found the coffee. There was a pot on. She looked at me. She said, "I hope that's all right." I said, "Sit down, your foot." She said, "I wrapped it." I said, "I see that. Sit down anyway." She sat. I poured coffee for us both and sat across the table, and we drank in silence for a moment, the way people do when there's a lot to figure out and neither one is rushing. She said, "I need to get to Rapid City. My cousin lives there. Her name is Helen Marsh. She's married to a man who runs the grain exchange on Cedar Street. If I could get to her, I'd be fine." I said, "How long have you been in this territory?" She said, 3 weeks. I came out from Ohio to marry William Aldridge. I'd known him from letters only. My father arranged it. A pause, her hands around the cup. My father was very pleased with the arrangement. I said, "And you?" She said, "I was agreeable to it at first." She turned the cup on the table. "He has a large ranch. He is well regarded. He came to Ohio to meet me and he was very—" She stopped. "He was very well presented." I said nothing. She said, "I should have looked harder." I said, "You were looking with the information you had." She looked at me. Like she hadn't expected that. Like it was a thing she hadn't given herself. She said, "The Aldridge Ranch is about 40 miles southeast of here, at the edge of your range. I saw your fences." She said it carefully, like she was giving me information she thought I should have. I said, "I know where Aldridge's land is." She said, "Do you know him?" I said, "I know of him." She said, "Then you probably know his reputation." I said, "I know his father was a fair man. I know William Aldridge is not his father." She nodded. Something in her chest let out a little. Sometimes what people need most is just to be believed, plainly, without ceremony. For someone to hear what they're saying and nod and not ask them to prove it. Rapid City was 3 days' ride from my land. The stage from Elk Creek came through Wentworth on Tuesdays and Fridays, and this was a Thursday, which meant the nearest stage was Wentworth on Friday. Wentworth was 12 miles north. I could have her there by midday. But her foot wasn't right for a hard ride, not yet. I said, "You can stay until Saturday. The stage runs again Friday. We go Friday morning." She said, "I don't want to be a burden." I said, "You said that last night." She said, "I meant it last night too." I said, "The stage runs twice a week. Your foot needs 3 more days. That's the calculation." She looked at me, trying to read the terms. There's always terms, she was thinking. You don't get something without the terms. I said, "There are no terms. You're a person who needs a place to be for 3 days. This is a place." She was quiet a long moment. Then she said, "All right." I said, "We have a spare horse, light bay, gentle. You can ride her when you're ready. There is work here if you want work. My son's wife is away and the garden is getting past. Only if it suits your foot." She said, "The garden would be good." I said, "The carbolic is on the 2nd shelf. Change the wrapping every morning." She said, "I know how to dress a wound. I grew up on a farm." I said, "Ohio." She said, "Eastern Ohio, Tuscarawas County." The ghost of something, a real smile, not a polite one. "Not the same country as this." I said, "No." She said, "No," and looked out the window at the plains coming light under the morning. The look of someone calculating the difference between the place they came from and the place they are, and not having settled it yet. Those 3 days. I think about them differently now than I thought about them while they were happening. While they were happening, I was occupied. Fence work on the north pasture. Branding the late calves with Hoxie and my younger son Chask, who had ridden over from his own place 2 miles east. Talking with the federal agent's man, a young clerk named Henderson who wore his hat like he was afraid of the sun, and always seemed to be taking notes on things that weren't worth noting. The ordinary work of a man, in the middle of a working life. What I noticed while it was happening were specific things, not impressions, things. The way she moved through the garden, slow because of the foot but efficient, no wasted motion. She'd found the hoe herself. She was taking out the crabgrass between the bean rows, which was exactly what needed doing. The way she spoke to Crow when she passed the corral, not baby talk, just a word or two direct. Crow, who liked almost no one, stood at the fence and let her scratch his nose. The way she handled the information of the house. By the second day, she knew where everything was without asking. She'd found the extra lamp oil. She'd found the spare wool blanket folded on the high shelf in the back room and brought it out to the porch because the nights were cold. She did these things without announcing them, the way a person does when they're used to taking care of a place and find it natural. The way she ate, with appetite, clean plate, no apology. The way she looked at me, which was direct. She didn't drop her eyes. She didn't soften every sentence the way some people do around me, that particular whitening of the voice that men and women do when they're working hard at being respectful in a way that lands as something else. She talked to me like I was a person she was talking to. That's a simple thing. It is not as common as it should be. The third evening, Thursday, I was at the table working on a survey map that Henderson had brought out, marking the actual boundaries against what the map showed, which were two different things because whoever drew this map had never been here and had done it by approximation and guesswork. Clara was at the other end of the table with a lamp, mending one of Hoxie's shirts. She'd found a needle and thread in the sewing kit on the window shelf. Nobody asked her to. She said without looking up, "This man Henderson." I said, "Yes." She said, "Is he trouble?" I said, "Not yet, could be, depends on what he's writing down." She said, "He's writing down more than the survey." I looked up, she was still on the shirt. I said, "What do you mean?" She said, "I came out when he was here. He stopped talking when he saw me, not in the way people stop talking when a woman comes into the room. In the other way." I thought about that. I said, "He asked you questions?" She said, "Two." I answered one and looked at him until he moved on to the other subject. I said, "Which one didn't you answer?" She said, "He asked how long I'd been here." I understood. I said, "He'll report to Aldridge." She said, "I expect so." She bit the thread, set the shirt down. "I'm sorry, I've brought that on you." I said it was already coming. Henderson was going to write something regardless. This gives him a line. She said, "What will Aldridge do?" I said, "Nothing immediately. He's a man who uses others. He'll send someone first, then come himself if that fails." She said, "To bring me back." I said, "That would be his story." She said, "What would the real story be?" I said, "To make it known in this valley that a man can walk onto my land and walk off with something that's mine to protect." I paused. "Or something that was meant to be his. Either reading works for him." She was looking at me now. She said, "You said something that's yours to protect." I said, "That's what you are. On this land, in this house, you're under my protection. That's a real thing out here." She held that, her hands flat on the table. She said, "He won't just let it go." I said, "No." She said, "And you?" I said, "I've held this land against harder men than William Aldridge." Something moved in her face, not relief exactly. It was more like a wall going down, the particular wall a person builds when they've been handling everything alone and they encounter, unexpectedly, something solid enough to lean against. She said, "I've been afraid since I left, every mile of it." She said it plain, no drama, like she was filing a report. "I'm not afraid right now." I said, "Good." She said, "That means something. I want you to know that means something." I said, "I know." We went back to our work. The lamp between us, the survey map on my side, the mended shirt on hers, the stove ticking as it cooled. Outside, one of the horses moved in the corral, a soft thud of a hoof. I didn't say anything else. I didn't need to, that was enough for that night. They came Friday morning. I'd been up before light, which is my habit. Hoxie was already at the barn. Clara was up too. I heard her in the back room, moving. I was at the stove when I heard horses, 3 of them coming up the track from the south road. I went out on the porch without my coat. It was cold, clear, the sky just going gray in the east. The 3 men came up to the yard gate. I knew 2 of them. Chet Darby, who was Aldridge's foreman, a lean, pale man with a cattleman's squint and a way of standing that meant he'd done this kind of thing before. Beside him, one of the Aldridge ranch hands I'd seen in town. The 3rd man I didn't know. Darby pulled up at the gate. He didn't come in. He knew better than to come in without a word from me. He said, standing elk, "We're looking for a woman. White woman, dark hair. We heard she might have come this way." I said, "Who told you that?" He said, "Nobody specific. Word gets around." I said, "Word from Henderson." He didn't answer that. I said, "What do you want with her?" He said, "She's Mr. Aldridge's concern. She was set to be married. She ran off. He's just concerned for her welfare." I said, "Is he?" Darby said, "She's alone out here. Could be hurt, could be." I said, "She's not alone. She's on my land." Quiet, the horses shifting. The 3rd man I didn't know was watching the door of the house. I made note of that. Darby said, "We'll need to see her, just to know she's all right." I said, "I'm telling you she's all right. That should be enough." He said, "Mr. Aldridge would feel better if we could." I said, "I don't care what Mr. Aldridge feels better about. She came to my land. She is under my protection. That means she stays until she decides to leave, and she goes where she decides to go. If she decides to go back to Aldridge, I'll take her myself. She doesn't decide that, she goes somewhere else, and that's the end of it." Darby looked at me a long time. He was calculating the distance between what he wanted and what it would cost to take it. The door behind me opened. I didn't look. I heard her step on the porch boards. Clara said, "I'm not going back." Darby's eyes went to her, then back to me. He said, "Ma'am." She said I was very clear, "I'm not going back." Her voice was level, no tremor. "If Mr. Aldridge has something to say, he can say it to me in front of a judge in Rapid City with my cousin present. Otherwise, we're done here." The 3rd man I didn't know said something low to Darby. Darby shook his head, just barely. He said, "Mr. Aldridge won't be happy." I said, "That is also not my concern. You ride out the way you came, and you tell William Aldridge that this woman is under my protection and will be delivered safe to her family in Rapid City. If he has a legal grievance, he can pursue it legally. If he decides to pursue it any other way, he will be making a mistake." Darby looked at me. He was reading something in my face, the thing that men read in other men's faces when they're deciding if the words are real. He read it. He said, "All right," short, flat. He turned his horse, and the other 2 turned with him, and they went back down the south track at a walk. I watched them until they were out of the yard. Clara was beside me on the porch. I turned to look at her. She was watching them go, her arms folded against the cold, her breath coming out in small, even clouds. Her foot was wrapped fresh. Her hair was back up pinned, the way it had been when I found her except cleaner. She said quietly, "He'll come himself next." I said, "Yes." She said, "Soon." I said, "Probably this afternoon. He was waiting somewhere close, sending them first to see if there was resistance." She said, "And when he comes?" I said, "Then we have that conversation." She turned and looked at me. She said, "Standing elk." My name from her mouth. She'd used it before, but this time it had a different weight to it, like she'd decided something about it. She said, "I want you to know I'm not afraid of him. I'm not going back. I need you to know that before he gets here, so you understand that I'm not asking you to fight my battle." I said, "I know that." She said, "But I'm glad you're here." I said, "Go get your things ready. We'll ride to Wentworth after." She said, the stage is on Friday. I said, I know, I'll take you. I'll stay until you're on it. She looked at me a moment longer, then she went inside. I stood on the porch until the dust from Darby's horses had settled back onto the south road, and there was nothing moving out there but the grass. Aldridge came at midday. He came alone, which surprised me. That kind of man usually doesn't come alone, but he rode up the track by himself on a big black horse, dressed like he'd been planning to come since he woke up. Good boots, coat, the kind of hat that costs money. He was younger than I'd expected, maybe 35, broad through the shoulders with a face that had been handsome and still was, in the way that certain kinds of damage can still look like health from a distance. He stopped at the gate and looked at the house, and then at me standing on the porch. He said, Standing Elk. I said, Aldridge. He said, You know why I'm here. I said, You came to make your case. He said, She's my fiancée. I said, She says she isn't. He said, She made a commitment. I said, She changed her mind. That's her right. He said, She's on my land. I said, This isn't your land, this is my land. He smiled, not a good smile, the kind that's used to having something work. He said, You've got a nice piece here, good range, the kind of range a man can build on. It'd be a shame to see it get complicated. I said, Is that what you're doing, coming here to tell me it's a shame? He said, I'm coming here to take what's mine. I said, She's not yours, she was never yours. She walked out before she was yours. What you had was a plan, and plans change. He said, You're an Indian. You don't get to tell me. I said, Come onto this land. Say that on this land. He stopped. He had been leaning forward in the saddle, the way men do when they're about to press forward, and something in my voice stopped him. Not a shout. I don't shout. But there is a way of saying a thing that leaves no space around it, no air for doubt, and he heard that. I said, I will say this once. She doesn't want you. She has told you. I have told you. You will leave this place. You will not look for her, and you will not send men to look for her. If you do, I will know about it within a day, because I know this valley better than you know your own house, and I will make of it exactly the kind of problem you cannot fix with money or with men. Are we clear? He looked at me. His jaw was set. He was used to things moving when he pressed them, and I wasn't moving. He said, She tell you what she is. Some schoolteacher's daughter from Ohio who. I said, She's a woman who walked 2 days through the Badlands rather than stay in your house. That tells me everything I need to know about what she is and what you are. He went very still. The black horse moved under him, feeling whatever was in his body, and he pulled the reins. The door opened behind me. Clara came out. She walked to stand beside me, not behind me, beside me, close enough that I could feel her there. She said, William. He looked at her. Something in his face changed, not softened, something else. The particular expression of a man seeing clearly for the first time the ground he's lost. She said, I will not be coming back. If you attempt to interfere with my travel to Rapid City, I will file a complaint with the Territorial Marshal's office, and I will have my cousin's husband, who is known to 3 members of the Territorial Assembly, make sure that complaint is heard. I know what I'm saying, and I mean every word of it. A pause. Goodbye, William. He sat there on his black horse. He looked at her, then at me, then back at her. And something went out of him, that pressed forward energy, the thing that makes a certain kind of man dangerous. It went out like a lamp turned down. He turned the horse. He rode out at a walk. He didn't look back. I stood on the porch until he was off my land. Clara was standing very close beside me. I could feel her breathing. When his horse cleared the last fence line and went out of sight down the south road, I heard her let out a long, slow breath. She said very quietly, He's gone. I said, He won't come back. She said, How do you know? I said, A man like that is used to pressing things that give. I didn't give. Now he'll go find something else to press. She was quiet, then she said, "I'm sorry you had to do that." I said, "Don't be." She said, "He'll make trouble for you. He'll go to people who listen to him." I said, "Let him. My land is mine. My rights are documented. Henderson's survey is mine also. Aldridge doesn't have a move that I haven't already blocked." I paused. "I've been doing this for 30 years. I know how it works." She turned and looked up at me. This close in the midday light, her eyes were definitely blue, that gray blue of the sky just before rain. Tired still under the surface. But something had come in behind the tired. Something that was beginning to look like rest. She said, "You're a very capable man." I said, "In this valley, yes." She said, "Not only in this valley." I said, "Go eat something. We ride in 2 hours." We rode to Wentworth. The stage came through at 10 in the morning and it was on time, which was not always the case. I'd ridden in with Clara on the bay horse, with Hoxie riding behind us at a distance, not because I needed him, but because he wanted to come and I didn't have a reason to say no. He'd grown some in those 3 days too. I'd seen him talking to Clara the second evening, out in the garden, both of them standing in the last light. She was showing him something about the bean plants, where the beetles were getting in. He was 23 years younger than me, and he listened to her like she was interesting. She was. At the stage office, Clara dismounted, and I tied the horses, and we stood on the porch to wait. She'd paid for her ticket from a small fold of bills she'd had pinned inside the wedding gown when she ran, which she'd transferred to her pocket. The dress itself she'd left folded on the bed in the back room. She'd found a plain brown skirt and a shirt in a bundle of extra clothes that had been left at my house by various people over the years. This happens when you're a place that people pass through, and she looked like herself in them. More herself than the gown, I thought. She said, "I'm going to write to you." I said, "You don't have to." She said, "I know I don't have to." I said, "The address is just my name and the Cheyenne River country. The postmaster at Wentworth knows where I am." She said, "I'll write when I get to Helen's, just to let you know I arrived." I said that would be good. She looked out at the street. A dog was crossing in no hurry. A man outside the hardware was loading something into a wagon. The ordinary business of a small town, going on around us, without any knowledge of what had happened on my land in the past 3 days. She said, "Can I ask you something?" I said, "Yes." She said, "You didn't have to do any of this. You could have." She paused, started again. "Most men would have left me in that wash." I said, "Most men would have been wrong." She said, "Why did you stop?" I said, "Because my horse did." She looked at me. Then she laughed. It was the first time I'd heard her laugh. It was a real one. It surprised her, I think, the same way it surprised me. She said, "That's the honest answer, isn't it?" I said, "Crow is a good judge." She said, "Of people." I said, "Of everything." She was quiet a moment. Then she said, "I mean, what would have made you ride on, if it had been a different man? Would a different man have ridden on?" I thought about that, honestly. I said, "A different man might have, yes." She said, "Then I'm glad it was you." I said, "So am I." The stage came in. The driver brought it in faster than he should have, but they always did on this stretch, showing off for whoever was waiting. It came to a stop in a cloud of fine dust, and the horses bunched and then settled. Clara turned to me. She put her hand on my arm, her hand on my forearm, just above the wrist, through my coat sleeve. A real grip, not a polite touch. The way you hold onto something that has held onto you. She said, "Standing elk. What you did," she stopped, shook her head, tried again. "Nobody did that for me before. Just," she gestured with her other hand, a short gesture that meant the house, the food, the porch, Aldridge at the gate, all of it. Just looked at me like I was worth looking after. I said, "You are." She said, "I know that now." She held my arm a moment longer. "I know that now." She let go. picked up the small bag she'd packed from the spare clothes, looked at me once more, that direct gray-blue look, and nodded. She boarded the stage. I stood on the porch until it moved out. She appeared in the window as it passed. She raised one hand. I raised mine. Then it was gone down the north road. Hoxie came up beside me. He said in Lakota, "She'll come back." I said, "Don't make things up." He said, "I'm not making things up." I said, "Let's go home." We rode south. She wrote in 11 days. The letter came to the Wentworth post office, and a rider brought it out with the other mail. Hoxie handed it to me without comment, which meant he knew what it was, and was doing an excellent job of being casual about it. It was 3 pages. Clara Prentice wrote the way she talked, direct, no fuss, organized, like she'd thought about what she wanted to say before she said it. Her cousin Helen was well. The grain exchange was thriving. Rapid City was bigger than she'd expected. She had found work at a doctor's office as an assistant, which suited her because she liked the practical application of things. She had filed a written account with the Territorial Marshal's office regarding her departure from the Aldridge Ranch, which her cousin's husband had ensured was properly received. She was well. In the 3rd paragraph she wrote, "I think about your land. I don't mean that as a sentimental thing. I mean the actual land, that country along the Cheyenne, the mornings especially. There is something in how the light hits the grass out there that I don't have a word for yet." In the last paragraph she wrote, "I think you are a man who has been asked to justify himself many times in his life when no justification was required. I want you to know that I see that. I want you to know that from where I stand, which is not so far away, you are one of the most decent human beings I have ever met. I am not saying that to be kind. I am saying it because it is accurate and because I think you should hear it." I read that part 3 times. I sat at the table in my house for a long time with that letter. The fire was down. The lamp was burning. Outside, the wind was doing something complicated in the cottonwoods along the river. I am not a man who requires much. I was not looking for anything. I had a life that was full, a real life, with real work and real sons and 40 years of knowing this country in my bones. I had mourned my wife, carried that grief, laid it down in its time. I was not a man who needed a letter from a woman in Rapid City to confirm his worth. But there is a difference between not needing a thing and the particular feeling of receiving it anyway. I had found her by the smell of blood in the bottom of a dry wash. I had given her food and a bed and 3 days and the use of my land and my name. I had stood between her and a man who used his fists on things he thought he owned. That was the plain accounting of it. Any decent man would have done the same, and I knew it. But she hadn't said that any decent man would have done it. She'd said that I had done it. This man, this particular one, and that she saw him. I wrote back, "I will not put the whole of what happened in the months after into this account. It isn't the kind of thing that fits in a straight line. It was letters first. 6 of them from me, 8 from her, over the course of what was left of that summer and into the fall. Then she came back, not to stay, just to see the land again," she said, which was also a way of saying something else. She stayed 4 days, and my older son spent most of them contriving reasons to be somewhere else, because he was correct about what was happening and was handling it the only way he knew how, which was by not standing directly in front of it. She brought her medical knowledge. She was not a doctor, but she'd been working with one for 2 months, and she knew more than I did, which was saying something since I'd been patching men and animals in this country for decades. She looked at the ranch hand Chask had hired in August, a young man named 2 horses who'd taken a bad kick from a mare and set the fracture himself crooked, and she told me and Chask exactly what to do about it, which we did, and it healed right. The 2nd time she came back, she stayed 10 days. The 3rd time she came back, she didn't leave. It wasn't a ceremony. The Lakota way of making a marriage is different from the Ohio way, and we were neither fully one nor fully the other, and after a certain age a man and a woman don't require as much ceremony as they might have once. We made an accounting to each other, in private, of what we were and what we had and what we intended. That was enough. Hoxie and Chask were there. Helen Marsh came from Rapid City for the day. There was food, the good kind, and a fire outside because the October night was clear and cold. At the end of it, Clara stood beside me in front of the fire. The valley was dark in all directions, the grass silver where the firelight hit it, the river running black and quiet 30 yards behind the house. She put her hand in mine, just that, her hand in my hand, and the heat of the fire and my son's on the other side of it. Chask, who was the quieter of the two and saved his words for when they were exactly right, said in Lakota, "She has a good way about her." He meant it as high praise. It is. I am 61 now. I don't know exactly where this account will land, who will hear it, but I'll say what's true. This is what I know about the years that followed. I know that I kept the land. The federal situation in the Dakota Territory grew complicated, as it always does, and there were 2 more surveys and 3 more clerks, and 1 lawyer from back east who spent 6 weeks trying to find a hole in my documentation and couldn't, because I had been very careful for a very long time, and because a man who ranches his own land and builds his own house and pays his own taxes does not have a lot of holes to find. Aldridge moved out of the valley the following year. I don't know where he went. I don't think about it. I know that my sons, both of them, became men I am proud of. Hoxie runs the North Range now. Chask has a fine herd of his own and a wife and 4 children, the youngest of whom is named after my daughter who died, the girl whose face I see in the fire sometimes. When I told Chask I wanted to do that, use her name again, he looked at me for a long moment and then said yes without any more words, and that was the right answer. I know that 2 Horses, the young man whose fracture Clara fixed, became one of the best ranch hands in this part of the territory. He has a good eye for horses and a natural patience that I've never been able to teach, only find in a person or not. He calls Clara by a Lakota name she was given by the older women at a gathering a few months after she came to stay. It means, roughly, woman who walks straight. I've never heard a better name for anyone. I know that Clara is, to this day, not easy. She is direct and she expects things done right, and she doesn't offer praise cheaply. She has no patience for men who talk more than they work. She has a laugh that still surprises me sometimes, the same way it did that first time on the porch in Wentworth, the real one, the one that gets away from her before she can decide to have it. I know that on the nights when the old wounds are bad, I was shot in the right shoulder in 1873, and the cold gets into it in winter and stays. She will sit up with me without making a production of it. She brings the liniment. She doesn't ask if I'm all right, because I am clearly not entirely all right, and she is not a woman who asks pointless questions. She just stays. That is not a small thing. Anyone who thinks that is a small thing has not been alone for a long time. I know that this valley, which has known me for 30 years and watched me build every fence post and every stone wall and every season of it, watched me bury my wife in the ground north of the house and watched me work through the grief and come out the other side. This valley accepted Clara the way it accepts everything that belongs here, not with a ceremony or a declaration, but with time, with season after season of her being present in it. The ranchers in the valley, even the ones who had difficulty with me on principle, came to know her first, because she was easier for them to approach, and then through her came to know me in a way that was also easier. I'm not sure I like that entirely, but I understand that some doors open from one side and some from the other, and the thing is to get through them. The Lakota people in the valley, the families we are close to, the ones who come and go, received her with more care but also more finality in the end. She learned. She has a good ear and she applied herself, and she speaks enough Lakota now to make herself known in a conversation, which matters more than people think. She does not pretend to be what she is not. She is Clara, from Tuscarawas County, Ohio, who walked into this country in a wedding gown and walked out of it into a life. She doesn't apologize for what she is, and the people here respect that. I know that she still writes letters, to Helen mostly. To the doctor she worked for in Rapid City, a man named Calloway who sends her medical journals from back east because she asked him to. She reads them. I've seen her with them at the kitchen table, her coffee going cold beside her, turning pages in that focused way of hers like the pages owe her something. I know that she knows this land now. The mornings especially, she said in that first letter. That's still true. I will come out at first light and she'll be on the porch before me sometimes in her coat, her coffee in her hands, watching the light come over the grass. She doesn't say anything about it. She just watches. I know that I am not a man much given to summing up. I don't believe in drawing lines under things. But there is a shape to a life when you look back at it from some distance, and the shape of mine has a clear hinge in it, which is a dry wash south of the Cheyenne River on an evening in early summer when my horse slowed down and turned his head 10 degrees west. I didn't know what I was riding toward. I knew she needed water, then food, then a place to rest. I knew she was under my protection, and I acted on that because I am the man I am, and that is what a man in my position does. I didn't do it for a reward. I didn't do it because I was lonely, though God knows I was. I did it because it was the thing to do and I was capable of doing it and she needed it done. What came after that is not the story I set out to tell. It's the story that happened. She is inside right now. I can hear her, the specific sounds of her in the house, the sounds I know so well by now that I stop hearing them the way you stop hearing the river. Until the moment you start hearing them again, and then they land all over you at once. There is a photograph of us that Chask took last spring with the camera he bought from a traveler. We are standing in front of the house. I am in my good coat. She is in her brown skirt, the same cut as the one she left in. Her hand is on my arm. That same grip, the real one, the one that holds. We are both looking at the camera. There is a photograph of us, and in it, I look like a man who has his ground under him and the sky above him, and a woman beside him who chose to be there. That is exactly what I am. Crow is 23 years old now, and he should be dead, but he isn't, because he is that kind of horse. He's out in the corral. In the morning he'll be at the fence and she'll go out and scratch his nose and he'll stand there like the emperor of the world. He picked her out first. I've never forgotten that. He knew.